Chapter 6. Though she was amiable, charitable, and kind to a degree, no one with a pair of eyes in his head would have mistaken her for a saint. She was made of a commoner humanity than that, and took full advantage of her father's blindness to scowl and grimace, and sometimes shake her small fierce fist when the blind man's disability caused her irritation or annoyance, which it often did. Thus, when Mr. Mansfield blundered and broke some precious piece of porcelain, she'd cast her eyes to the ceiling with a look of phenomenal rage, but declared, "'Twas only a chipped cup, sir. I promise you, I'm glad it's gone. Come, sir, let me help you," and her voice was always kind and gentle. For all of the 12 years, this outward show of human feelings, unseen by her father, had somehow created within a disposition of rare excellence, so that at 21 she stood not very tall, but of great consequence, the most kindly but peevish, and although remarkable, young woman in the length and breadth of Vine Street. Miss Mansfield stood on the topmost step, full in the light of the porch lamp. Below her waited a footman, ready to help his master. "Papa," she cried warmly, "I was so worried. You've been gone so long, sir. I thought you was—" Here she paused as Smith came into the light, and she saw, what the blind man could not, that Smith was the filthiest, wretchedest, and nearly the most sinister-looking object in the town. Lost. She finished up, and her face expressed wonderfully her opinion of Smith. Smith tugged at Mr. Mansfield's hand, for he feared Miss Mansfield would set the footman on to do him a mischief. "Daughter," said the blind man, "here's Smith, as good-hearted a child as the town can boast of." Miss Mansfield did not look as though she believed it. Her face was very clearly so. "You've deceived him. Very well, then. You don't deceive me. I've a pair of eyes in me head." But aloud she said, "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Smith. Any friend of my father's is more than welcome." "Daughter," said Mr. Mansfield, mounting the steps and pulling Smith after him, "my young friend's taking supper with us, and then he'll stay the night, for it's very bitter in the air, and he's far from home." At this, Miss Mansfield looked so little pleased that Smith was amazed that even the blind man couldn't see it. "Any friend of ours, sir," she repeated, and bustled back into the house to attend to her father's wish. They took supper in the back parlour, as clean, spacious, and handsome a room as Smith had ever dreamed of, furnished with mahogany and with much neat silver on display. There were pictures on the wall and a fire in the grate, and it was a shame the blind man could see none of it, for a deal of trouble seemed to have been taken. While they ate, Miss Mansfield came and went some dozen times with amiable inquiries or amusing observations. She was very talkative and spoke rather quick, but always with a look of sharper suspicion, as Smith followed by a glance round the room to see what had been stolen. "I know what you're up to," her angry face said, "but you'll not succeed. But not that while I've a pair of eyes in my head." "A saint," remarked Mr. Mansfield once, when he was assured his daughter was gone from the room. "Oh," said Smith. "You don't meet with a saint every day, Smith," said Mr. Mansfield, sounding somewhat offended by the cool response. "No, you don't." Just then the saint came in to say Smith's bed was ready in a small room at the top of the house, and to shoot him as venomous and disgusted a look as ever had been received in his life. He shivered, for he found his haven for the night uncanny. What with the blind justice and the daughter at odds with herself. None the less, he was at bottom an affable soul, and continued to talk with Mr. Mansfield a while longer. He talked about life in the streets of the town, life in the Red Lion cellar, life in the Newgate jail, death at Tyburn, and death in Curtis Court. Yes, indeed, Smith mentioned, almost in passing, the happening that had turned him upside down and inside out. "Indeed, I heard of it," said the magistrate gravely, "for the gentleman was known and wealthy." Poor old so-and-so, said Smith. Did you see him then? No, said Smith quickly, for how could he have known which was the old gentleman unless he'd seen him murdered? And if he'd seen the unlawful act, why hadn't he come forward? Yes, indeed, Smith knew the law, and he suspected that the magistrate knew it even better. No, I never saw him, but I heard about it, poor old so-and-so. Even as he spoke, some movement in the air, most likely due to their voices, caused the sideboard candle to flicker and jump and glint ironically in the blind man's dark spectacles, and a shadow was cast upon the opposing wall, strangely like the shape of the murdered old gentleman. Some come quietly into the room to reproach Smith for denying him and to see what was becoming of his document. A Mr. Field of Prickler's Hill in Hertfordshire. I knew him, Smith. A good but sad old gentleman. I'd like to have his murderer before me. And so would I, Mr. Mansfield, muttered Smith sombrely, for he remembered well the old gentleman's look as the knife had gone in. Why was he done in? I don't know, Smith, I don't know. But it's a vile, dark business. Mr. Mansfield, ordinarily bland face, grew hard and grim. It troubles me, he murmured, more to himself than to Smith. What troubles you, Mr. Mansfield? My blindness, because I shall never clap eyes on that murderer. Because till the day I die, I'll never know what such a monster looks like. Do you understand me, Smith? Do you understand that to me, devils and angels are all one? Smith did not entirely understand the blind man's strange sorrow, maybe because his mind was filled with the news that Mr. Field had been wealthy. Hopes of the document were now very high. Do you understand me, Smith? Smith nodded, then recollected about Mr. Mansfield couldn't see him, and said, yes, indeed, and went on thinking of his prospects. Soon after this, Miss Mansfield came into the room and declared that it was growing too late to be talking. Not so much for you, Papa, but for your young friend. Truly, he looks tired, sir. His bed is ready, and he ought to be in it. Which remark, delivered most affably, was accompanied by a casting of eyes to the ceiling, which said very plain, and the sheets he sleeps in will have to be burned. Oh, Papa, this is outrageous. Smith's room was small and oddly shaped, owing to its situation under the roof. It was as though the builder, arriving nearly at the summit of his labour, had come upon this extra space by surprise, and on the spur of the moment had popped a door and a window in it, so as not to embarrass the stairs with leading to nowhere. A bed, a chest, a chair were the sole furnishings, and a pot of strong sweet herbs. For though Miss Mansfield could burn the sheets after Smith had slept in them, she could not burn the room, so the herbs were the next best thing. Now Smith, though he'd slept on straw all his life, wasn't so ignorant as to not know a bed when he saw one. He prodded it, he sat on it, he lay on it, he lay in it, he grinned and directly went to sleep. This had not been his intention. He'd meant to have a great brood on his curious situation and enriched hopes, but the day had been too long for him, and the night too fierce. He was tired almost unto death. He slept without dreaming, without moving. He slept so long and so deep that Miss Mansfield, poking her head around the door in the morning, thought for an instant that he'd perished in the night and left behind him a small black corpse. "Smith!" she cried. "Boy, wake up directly!" And she poked at him with a walking stick she seemed to have brought especially for the purpose. Smith woke up, saw Miss Mansfield's ferocious concern, and rolled deftly away. But he forgot he was sleeping 2 feet off the floor, and fell, and swore. "Language!" shrieked Miss Mansfield, and poked at Smith furiously with the stick. He howled. "What's wrong?" Mr. Mansfield cried from below. "Nothing, Papa. Your young friend fell out of bed. Ha ha! No harm done." Smith, unable to reach the door, had bolted under the bed, and there he crouched, very like a mouse, staring at Miss Mansfield's neat ankles and brisk black shoes. "Come out," she muttered, and down flew her head, with her braided hair falling bolt downward to the floor like a pair of handsomely turned table legs. "No one's going to harm you," and she prodded him with his stick to prove it. "Are you here, daughter?" Came a second pair of feet, large and slippered. Miss Mansfield's head, with a last furious scowl, vanished. Papa, you shouldn't have come without help. You might have fallen, sir. Mr. Mansfield laughed. Miss Mansfield's feet shifted impatiently. The point of her stick kept prodding her toes, as if in default of another target. Morning, Smith. Sleep well? My daughter has a fine breakfast for you. She's a saint, child. As I told you, a real saint. Down came the saint's head. Come out, said her angry eyes. Come out, you disgusting object. Up went her head and vanished from view. Morning, Mr. Mansfield. Smith had no quarrel with the blind man. What? Back in bed? The slippered feet moved towards him. The voice betrays you. Give me your hand. Miss Mansfield's head was back again, peering around her father's ankles. Her lips moved. Please come out. Sourly triumphant, Smith shook his head. Where's your hand, Smith? Mr. Mansfield voiced, puzzled. Miss Mansfield's eyes were filled with tears. I beg you, for pity's sake, boy, don't shame me in these blind eyes. Bewildered, Smith stared back. The house had made a discovery. The cat was as frightened and lost as lonely as he, which was no comfort at all. Gloomily he came out. Here's me hand, then, you old blind justice, you. Over the breakfast, which was taken in the back parlour, Mr. Mansfield said, And will you go back to your cellar, Smith? Smith shrugged his thin shoulders. Miss Mansfield looked at him, and then to her father in weary aggravation. Did the blind man live but to spite her? What was he thinking of? So why didn't he come out with it then? Must everything be left to her? Smith, she said, affecting a careless, everyday tone not reflected in her face, Mr. Mansfield means, will you stay here? And work for your board and keep, of course. Mr. Mansfield is very concerned about you. He thinks you deserve better of the world than you've got, and would give it to you. My father is quite a saint, you know. Come, daughter, 'tis your own idea. Never in 10,000 years. I read it all in your face, sir. My face? 'Tis like an open book to me. Smith, his mouth full, looked from one to the other of the Mansfields, each accusing the other of kindness. He shrugged his shoulders. They might quarrel about it till the end of time. It would make no difference. He wasn't going to stay in that uncanny house. No, sir. Nothing on the earth would have kept him with the Mansfields, blind father and mad daughter. Then it's settled, said Miss Mansfield, with another irritated look at her father. Mr. Mansfield will employ you in the stable, Smith, and I, here she looked, God help me, will attend to your improvement. For a beginning, Smith, I shall teach you to read. Smith stared. He gaped. He poked his finger in his ear and scraped it about. What was it she'd said? Teach him to read? To read? He beamed and beamed. He couldn't stop himself. He wondered if his face would ever go back again. I think he's pleased, Papa, murmured Miss Mansfield in a low voice. I suppose he's fond of horses. Mr. Mansfield offered to send a servant to the Red Lion to acquaint Miss Fanny and Miss Bridget with their brother's situation, but Smith said he'd rather go himself. The last thing he wanted was the improvement boasted of in the Red Lion's cellar. For though he loved and trusted his sisters, he feared that under such tortures as the two men in brown might inflict, such as the sight of the 5 shillings, or even 4, they'd wag their tongues like a pair of windy flags. Smut's in Vine Street, poor little Smut. I'll tell him tomorrow, he said, and left it at that. Now all was settled indeed, and Smith, on Miss Mansfield's orders, returned to his mad-shaped room. In high good humour, he fell upon the bed and took out the precious document, the last remains of Mr. Field of Prickler's Hill in Hertfordshire. Excitedly, he waved it aloft like a banner. Won't be long now, old fellow. Very soon you and me will be better acquainted, and then up we'll go in the world. He folded it and wrapped it once more in the pilfered handkerchief, and not a moment too soon. Footsteps, quickly he pushed it into the tumbled bed linen. The door opened, 2 footmen with real hangman's faces. Alarm seized Smith. Why had they come, and why so grim? Up with you, said one. And then down with you, said the other. What do you mean? They grinned. Mrs. Instructions? She says, afore you commence and on scrubbing the yard, the self-same necessary thing must be done to you. So down to the scullery, young Smith. Smith's eyes glittered in alarm. Most likely he paled, too, but that was so easy to see. He looked about him. There was no escape. He looked up to the footmen. No mercy, nor pity given there. To the scullery, young Smith. Now, Smith had never been washed since. Most likely, the midwife had obliged 12 darkening years ago. Consequently, he suspected the task would be long, hard, and painful. He was not mistaken. 2 more footmen, aproned over their livery, stood ready and waiting by a steaming iron tub. Take off them wretched rags, Smith. Rags? What rags? The scullery was grey and stony and full of strong vapours. Your clothes, Smith. Take off your clothes. The window was barred and the door was shut. He was begun to undress. Disdainfully, the footman watched him, and indignantly he stared back. Ain't you never seen a person take off his clothes before? Disdain gave way to amusement and then to surprise. Several times the footmen reached forward to seize him, for they thought he'd finished, but each time he waved them back. Have the goodness to wait till I'm done, gentlemen. Have the goodness. For Smith wore a great many clothes. Indeed, to the best of anyone's knowledge, he'd never thrown a single item away. Coats and waistcoats worn to nothing but armlets, and thread now came off him, and shirts down to wisps and mournful lace, one by one, removed carefully and with dignity, then dropped gossamer like to the floor. Then there were breeches, consisting in nothing more than the ghosts of buttonholes, and breeches that came off in greasy strips, like over-cured slices of ham, and breeches underneath that where were no more than a memory of worsted printed on his lean, sharp bottom. These memories of perished clothes were everywhere, and plainest of all, on his chest, where there was so exact an imprint of ancient linen that Smith himself was deceived and made to take off his skin. At last he crouched, naked as a charred twig, quivering and twitching as the air was full of tickling feathers. Ready, he said, in a low, uneasy voice, and the 4 footmen set to work. 2 held him in the tub, 1 scrubbed, and 1 acted as a ladle man. The last task was on account of the water having been dosed with sulphur, and it consisted in spooning of Smith's livestock as it rushed to the surface in a speckled throng. From beginning to end, the washing of Smith took close upon 3 hours, with the scullery so filled with sulphurous steam that the footmen's misted faces grew red as the copper saucepans that hung like midnight suns on the scullery's streaming walls. At last it was done. He was taken out, rinsed, and wrapped in a sheet, the ghost of his former self, for he was now stark white, replica of the previous Smith, and had his sisters seen him, they'd have shrieked and sworn it was his spectral image. His clothes were burned before his oddly saddened eyes, which eyes were now seen to somewhat larger and rounder than might have been supposed. But his hair, in spite of shock and scrubbing, remained as black as the river at night. Me clothes, he said, me belongings, I can't go about like this. Then he was told a livery was being cut down for him, and he was to go to the back to his room and wait. He mounted the stairs, much hampered by the sheet he was wrapped in, but there was great determination in him. Each fresh disaster he endured seemed to strengthen his bond with the document, and whatever it might contain, in a way, it seemed to be payment in advance. He opened the door to his room. He stared, his eyes filled with tears of horror and dismay. The bed was stripped, the bedding was gone, and with it, the document.